Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Cosmic Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Adalina East, founder of Transformational Healing, among many other things, and lover of all spiritual seeking and the relationship between our spiritual seeking, our spiritual connection, and neuroscience. So, as a neuroscience researcher, I have looked into so many things over the years and have come to the conclusion that boundaries tend to be one of our most challenging things in life, but they are also one of the most rewarding. So, when I talk about boundaries, I'm talking about mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional boundaries, limits that we set with others and with our guides in order to have a more peaceful and sustainable life. When I was researching this episode, I started to look into the literature to be able to tell you some things about boundaries and about the research that's been done. I also channeled the guides about boundaries, about their opinions of boundaries, how we can set them, and all of those types of things. And I talked to some of you. You, as always, are the greatest resource. I love hearing from you. I love talking to you about boundaries or whatever else is happening in the ethers, in the collective right now, because I feel like we all go through the same things at the same time for a reason. And the more that we can share with each other, the more power we have going forward, and the more we can feel how things are going to look in the future. So, before we get started, I want to also just tell you about my multidimensional mentorship program. This is a program that I started, I think, 4 or 5 years ago, and it encompasses so many different things. This is a great program for you if you have always had spiritual gifts or intuitive gifts and you weren't quite sure what to do with them. I am of the belief that we all have spiritual and intuitive gifts, and we're given them for a variety of reasons. Some of us are meant to just work with our families or work with our friends. Some of us are meant to start a business or a healing practice. And some of us are meant to do both, and many other different things. So I've worked with actors, musicians, tarot readers, psychics, animal communicators, Akashic Records readers, healers, you name it. And what I've found we all have in common is this underlying knowing that we're meant for more and that we have more to offer the world than what we currently are offering. So if this describes you, if you also want to learn to tap into your unique spiritual gifts, please reach out to me. I'll include the link below to apply for the mentorship program. I have 2 spots coming up, and I would love to work with you. And without further ado, let's get into today's episode. So when I was looking through the literature about boundaries, I first of all found that there were so many different definitions. So the work that we do together, this neuroscience blended with spiritual work, this doesn't really exist in the research, which is something that I am trying to change. But research takes a great deal of funding. It takes a great deal of time. The research that I do is always self-funded because I don't want to be beholden to a major pharmaceutical company or something along those lines. Not that there's anything wrong with them. Thank you. We appreciate you. I just like to go my own way, as we all know. So when thinking about research on boundaries, what kept occurring to me was someone must have done a study on those who set boundaries and those who don't, and how people feel after they set a boundary, and how people's lives improve once they set a boundary. And I have to tell you, in all honesty, both Rosario and I could not find anything like that. We found a variety of other things that were interesting. We found that there was a study done about boundaries set between work and home, which, is always important. It's something that we all struggle with, I think, especially now that so many of us work from home. We found a study about exotic dancers setting boundaries in their places of work, which was also fascinating, but not exactly what I was looking for. And then we found studies about setting boundaries in a medical practice. So, like a doctor sets a boundary with a patient that they can't call him after a certain time. I mean, okay, I understand why they did that study. Clearly, it was funded by doctors in some form who wanted to prove that they also need time off, as we all do. Never any argument there from me. But I didn't find the exact kind of study that I was hoping to find. So perhaps I was meant to do this episode to prove that I have yet another area of research and that I will acquire funding for this area of research, et cetera, et cetera. However, I also think it's really important for us to talk about that, for us to talk about why no one has really dug into that study. There are a number of factors, I think, that would make it challenging to do so. It would all be self-rated, right? You'd have to set a boundary and then rate how you felt afterwards. And then the other people would have to not set a boundary and rate if they felt any better or worse in a few days. So I can see the research limitations, but I am one of those people who believes there is a way through every block there is. So don't be surprised if in a few years you hear about this type of study. In the meantime, though, I also want to talk about the difference between the kinds of boundaries we can set. So when we talk about boundary setting, I'm sure all of you have talked about boundary setting with your families, your friends, maybe your therapists or healers. We often talk about boundary setting from the perspective of emotional boundaries or physical boundaries, right? Like, for example, let's say your child says, Mom, I really want to go sleep over at Max's house tomorrow. You ask, are Max's parents going to be home? Have I met them? How do you know Max, et cetera, doing your usual due diligence. And you come to find out that Max's parents will not be home. You have never met them. You have never met Max. And you're just generally uncomfortable with that. So you say no. You set the boundary. The boundary is no. The boundary is no, you cannot sleep over at Max's. Yes, maybe someday, but I need to meet his parents first and, make sure that they're going to be home and all of those kinds of things. That's a very simple physical boundary. Setting it and maintaining it, of course, is not simple. I do not mean it in that way. I just mean it in the sense that this is a good example of setting a physical boundary for another person. You can also set a physical boundary for yourself. I am a New Yorker. I live in New Mexico now, and I love it. But when I lived in New York, I used to try to set a physical boundary around me on the subway. Almost never worked, but, I tried. I enjoyed trying not to have people basically sitting on my lap on the subway. I felt like that was asking just too much. And I like to have my own seat and or my own little tiny standing area without people on top of me. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But one way that I would use to set my boundary is to hold my bag on my shoulder towards the other person. So their body was not touching mine. They were just touching my bag, or maybe just a little piece of my arm. That was my way of trying to set a physical boundary without yelling at everyone on the subway to stay away from me, which of course would not be appropriate. But I feel all New Yorkers have at one point felt that way. We can also talk about what it's like to set an emotional boundary with someone. So this gets a little more complex, right? Because when you set an emotional boundary with someone, you have to be really clear. You have to be very concise about what it is. And the piece that I often find is missing when I'm working with clients is the why. So oftentimes when we're setting an emotional boundary with someone else, we want to give them a reason because it helps them abide by that boundary a bit better. But it also makes it a little bit more palatable. And I'm not saying this as a piece of guidance so much as just something that I have noticed in my one-on-one client sessions in my healing practice. So, for example, when we're setting an emotional boundary with someone, we always want to use I feel statements. Those of you who've ever been to therapy or worked with a healer, I'm sure are familiar with the I feel statements. But so let's say, for example, let's just take this very real life example. Joan is coming home from the gym And she goes to the gym maybe 4 times a week. When she comes home from the gym, she really doesn't want to be touched or talked to. She's kind of still in that mental state of creativity that a lot of us get from physical exercise. And so she wants to stay in that state while she goes and has a shower and starts to make her dinner. But her partner, excited to see her home after the day, wants to talk right away. And this really bothers Joan. And so she wants to set a boundary here so that she doesn't have to talk right away. So she says to her partner, I feel in this very creative state when I get home from the gym, and I just want to stay there for a little while. I want to take my shower. I want to start my dinner. I know you've already eaten, but I'm just not really ready to talk right when I get home. I feel a little too vulnerable, a little too out there to have a real conversation with you. And I want to be very present for every conversation that we have. So do you think that you could maybe wait 30 minutes after I get home before you start talking to me? This is A+ boundary setting. She used an I feel statement, made it not about him and his need to talk to her and all of that. She made it about her and her need for a little bit of quiet time right when she gets home from the gym. She let him know why. It's because she's in that creative state and she wants to stay there for a while. And she also gave him like a very discernible time limit. I find this works particularly well with men. So when we think about when someone sets a boundary with us, I personally can feel when they're kind of ready to talk to me. Like, let's say I'm having a fight with my partner and she needs some time and space. I can kind of tell when she's ready to talk again. But if that person is maybe not so tuned into your energy or so tuned into humans in general, which is absolutely okay. Not everyone is a people person, and that's fine. We need diversity in the world. It's always good to set a time. So try to, suss it out for yourself. Do you need 30 minutes when you get home, or do you need an hour? What would feel good to you? And you can always change up this time limit with the person that you're setting the boundary with as well. Not every boundary is meant to be held in stone forever. So when you're thinking about setting boundaries, emotional boundaries in particular, you want to think about I feel statements, make it about you, not about them. You want to think about a time limit. And then you want to think about how to explain the why in a way that's not going to amp the other person up, because then it becomes a fight. And we want everyone in our lives to have positive associations with boundaries. I believe a boundary is an act of love. And when you set that boundary, you're saying to that person, I trust you enough to tell you what I need, to set my boundary for myself. And I trust you enough that you're going to adhere to it, that you're going to follow it. And that is a huge, huge amount of trust. Think about that amount of trust. It's major. So when you're thinking about setting your boundaries with people, think about those things. I feel statements, the why in a way that's not offensive, and time limit. When we talk about spiritual boundaries, this, of course, brings us into a whole different light. So spiritual boundaries are the boundaries that you set with your spirit guides in order to have some time with no communication. And when I say no communication, I don't mean like you're going to wildly step out in front of a car because your spirit guide was supposed to tell you not to, and you told them you didn't have time for them right now. Not that at all. I'm just talking about having some time when you're not constantly receiving messages from them. For those of you who are not working with your spirit guides right now, no problem. This still applies to you in a variety of ways, and I'll leave it to you to figure out what ways those are throughout the rest of the episode. For those of you who are communicating with your spirit guides and who do hear from them, maybe at night, maybe in the morning, maybe throughout the day, I think this is a really beautiful practice to start to put into your toolbox, because it has changed my life so much. And I actually was just teaching a new mentorship client this practice today, because I feel like it is the answer to so many of the questions that we ask, not only each other, but that people ask me on Instagram, or that people ask other spiritual guides and people of my ilk, because it is such a big deal. So as an intuitive person, you're taking in information all the time, right? Like maybe you were an intuitive child, you were always hearing and seeing things that maybe other people weren't, or maybe it was also a thing about your emotions, like you were feeling other people's emotions as they were having them. And that has shaped you into the person that you are today. And that is a beautiful thing. Our sensitivity is our strength, as always. But when your spirit guides are keeping you up at night, channeling you messages, or when your spirit guides are interrupting you at work with something that, perhaps they're not tuned into the fact that you have to be very tuned in at work and on at work. Please remember, it's not that they mean any harm. It's not that they're not benevolent. It's just that their existence is very different than ours. And it's probably been a long time for them since they were in human form and they don't remember these things. So all you need to do in these moments when your spirit guides are channeling to you or trying to send you messages and you're busy doing something else, you set a boundary, just like you would set with a person. You don't have to be as careful, of course, because they are spirits and will not be offended, but it's good for practice. So we can practice setting boundaries with our guides. I'm going to give you a great example. This is the example that I gave my mentorship client today. She's having trouble sleeping. There's no sleep going on in her house. She has an 8-month-old baby. They're all up all night. Basically, the baby is cycling in that horrible way that newborn babies do, where they think night is day and day is night. And so no one's getting any sleep, not her 3-year-old, not her husband. And she's just exhausted. They're all at their wits' end. They've tried various sleep training techniques. For those of you who are parents, I know you know how it goes. So the other thing that's been happening is that as the baby is up all night, the guides are up all night too, and they're just channeling kind of nonstop. And so she'll be about to get to sleep, and then she'll suddenly feel one of her guides sending a message, and she feels like she has to get up and write it down because it's really important, but she's so tired and she doesn't want to get up and write it down. And who does? We don't need to do that. So she learned today how to set a boundary, and I'm going to teach all of you as well. Let us imagine that you are in the midst of doing something that requires calm and quiet and peace and no channeling of any kind. You are simply going to close your eyes for a moment and feel into that space that you're sharing with your guides right now. For those of you who are longer term clients or who've been doing this work for a while, you can meditate yourself up to that place of iridescent light if you want, or up to creator space, but you also don't have to. And you just say, spirits and guides of benevolence, I am so grateful for your presence, but I am now not available to receive messages, signs, channeling, healing. I'm not available right now. I am available between 4 and 6 p.m., or I am available between 5 and 7 a.m., whatever your times are. You can give them another time that works for you, or you can just say, I'm not available now. If you want to leave yourself open for their healing, but closed for channeling and messages, you can directly say that as well. I am not open to channeling or messages right now, but I am open to being healed. Thank you for respecting my boundaries. It is done. And then take a few deep breaths and open your eyes and trust that it is done. Trust that you have the ability to set boundaries and have them be followed, both by human beings and by spirit guides. Trust that you are powerful and that you are capable of setting boundaries and having them respected. Thanks so much for spending this time with me today. I love you all so much, and I look forward to seeing you next week.